Good evening, I am Harry and this is the Kwedu Report. From the shifting political sense of Australia and the United States to the ongoing security and judicial challenges across the African continent, the world remains in a state of rapid transformation. Tonight, we bring to you the sharpest insights into the stories shaping our local and, of course, the global landscape. To help me look at some of the stories we have, welcome Kwedu News editor, joining us away from Kwedu, Zimbabwe. Delicious, welcome to the Kwedu Report.
Thank you. Hi everyone.
Nous sommes fatigués par des massacres de tout genre. Nous sommes fatigués par des enterrements de nos frères. Nous sommes fatigués de ces carnages.
We begin our news with the news of a tragedy in Eastern Congo, where the ADF militants are reported to have killed at least 69 people. Now, a devastating overnight raid by the Allied Democratic Forces ADF has left at least 69 people dead in the Beni territory and Ituri province of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Of course, this war or conflict has been going on for years. Linked to the Islamic State, the militants looted and burned homes near the Ugandan border. Now, the ADF, originally formed in Uganda, is one of over 100 rebel groups active in the region. In a related development, Amnesty International has previously accused the group of war crimes. Officials have warned that the death toll may rise as such efforts continue for those that are missing. And in Australia, there was a political earthquake over the weekend when One Nation Party had the first ever historic win in an election. In a result that has stunned the Australian political establishment, the far-right One Nation Party has secured its first ever lower house seat in the federal parliament. The One Nation candidate, David Farley, won the fairer seat or by-election with a 42.3% of the primary vote, ending a coalition control that had remained unbroken since 1949. Some history being made there. Both the Liberal and National candidates were relegated to roughly 10% of the vote. National's Deputy Leader Bridget McKenzie has already signaled a willingness to work with One Nation to challenge the Albanese government. Now, in the US, in a move that not only undermines and threatens the Democrats' fight to regain control of Congress, that is in the November midterm elections, but also seriously threatens black representation and voting rights, the Virginia Supreme Court has struck down a Democratic redistricting map in a 4-3 decision, fueling a nationwide rush by the GOP to redraw congressional boundaries ahead of the 2026 midterms. Republican-led efforts in states like Tennessee and South Carolina, coupled with California's Democratic counter moves, could in the end result in a net gain of 14 winnable seats for the GOP. Of course, Trump making some moves there to secure his base. These moves are currently challenging key provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as both parties fight for control of the narrowly divided House. In other news, in West Africa, in Chad, a high court in N'Djamena, that's the capital, has sentenced 8 opposition leaders 8 years in prison, to 8 years in prison for insurrection. The group, part of the now dissolved GCAP coalition, had been vocal critics of President Mahamat Idris Deby. And in the neighboring country in Niger, the military government has also suspended 10 French media organizations, including France 24 and AFP, citing threats to public order. This marks a further decline in French influence in West Africa as the region pivots towards Russian and Chinese partnerships. We go back to the US, where the Trump administration is reportedly finalizing a $400 million settlement with TikTok over a 2024 allegations of child privacy violations. In a departure from standard legal practice, the funds are earmarked for Washington, D.C.'s beautification projects, including a proposed 250-foot triumphal arch. The deal includes no admission of wrongdoing and awaits final board approval. Delicious. What do we have from South Africa?
Okay, from this side, I'm seeing a story here saying in South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa faces domestic hits from the Democratic Alliance. Remember, the Democratic Alliance is in a coalition government with the ANC. So the story goes, the opposition, after a person of interest to South African law enforcement was spotted at a private meeting with the president of Zimbabwe, President Mnangagwa. Remember, Ramaphosa was in Zimbabwe in the recent past, and we saw some of the top business people accompanying the president Mnangagwa at his farm, and Whitney Chivai, who is allegedly a person of interest in South Africa. Remember the controversy around the procurement of the election material in the last election. So Chivai was part of that delegation that actually received and was going around with President Ramaphosa. And now looking at the justice system in Zimbabwe, Kwedu News has been running a story, I think, from the start, and it was recently finalized about a gang of ZANU-PF activists that were actually terrorizing people in the Koko area. So the story goes, in Koko, where a ruling ZANU-PF youth leader and a prison officer was sentenced to 11 years for the abduction and torture of a CID detective and another citizen, a rare instance of high-profile accountability for political violence. Why police and court officials are commended for bringing Marima to book, the big question is, was Marima acting alone? Remember the story of Marima, which is a prison officer at the same time is also a ZANU-PF activist. So you know that civil servants are not supposed to be active in terms of politics because they are supposed to serve the nation. And now we saw this particular youth leader being actively involved in ZANU-PF activities, despite him being employed as a prison officer. And he was actually allegedly abducting and torturing individuals, including a Kwekwe-based CID detective during the constitutional amendment bill number 3 consultations that were going on around. So it was him and the two others in the CID detective case. And then there's another case of a commuter or minibus operator that was actually also abducted in the same style. It was again Marima and I think it's 6 others that were actually part of that gang that actually abducted him and actually beat him up. And finally, you know, a lot of people, they assume that some of these youth leaders, when they act, actually there will be someone behind them who's actually protecting or sending them. So the question, I think it lingers, as in, were these activists actually acting alone, or the person who's sending them is still out there, and actually that culture that actually has sent them to 11 years to jail is still happening. We don't know. As you asked, we don't know who's behind them.
Yeah. Yes, that's very true, Delicious. To our viewers, those who are joining us, thank you very much for joining us today on the Kwedu Report, a program brought to you by Hericom Media. Now, in this program, we delve and dive into all the most powerful and topical stories from around the globe, where we try to analyze them as well as dissect them, give critical analysis and commentary. Now, staying a bit on the Marima case, who is a ZANU-PF youth leader and activist, preliminary investigations by Kwedu News at the moment they point to a powerful ZANU-PF leader being the power and force behind these evil acts. Now, but who is that powerful individual? Well, that's a video for another day. That's a question for another day. We promised you in our next video to go into detail and try to expose that person and highlight why he has not been arrested or charged. Make sure you don't miss the next episode of the Kwedu Report. Ladies and gentlemen, we now go to our last story of the day. Still in Zimbabwe, discussions intensify and continue over Zimbabwe's move to compensate farmers or farms protected under bypass.
Pane vatakatorera minda tichifungidzira kuti ndiye varungu vatema ma-indigenous farms pane 840 ari kudzorerwa, mazhinji acho atodzorerwa kwavari. Pane vatakatorera kune dzimwe nyika vatakanga tanyorera navo zvirongwa zviya zveinvestment protection anonzi mabhipa, takatora 67. Saka iwayo tiri munzira yekuvadzosera.
Analysts note that while the land reform was necessary to correct colonial imbalances, the fast-track implementation of a land reform program largely benefited political elites and was largely violent, leading to a current, at least soon after the land reform, agricultural deficit, where Zimbabwe was importing maize from a number of countries. But now I think the agricultural output, agricultural performance has started to pick up, with some of those farmers allocated land beginning to realize some good yields. But delicious, we see here a total of 67 farms have been listed according to Zimbabwe's agriculture minister as being given back to the former commercial white farmers, and also the government paying some money to these commercial white farmers. Is this a reversal of the land reform program? What is happening here, Delicious? What is at stake here?
Okay, I think it's a good move in terms of looking at from the perspective of the government, looking at how actually some of these arrangements were made. Remember the land reform that actually took place in the year 2000, whereby we saw a fast-track land reform, and some of these farms that were actually protected under government-to-government agreements, some of these farms were actually taken, and we also saw some local indigenous Zimbabweans actually losing some farms to the process, and also some indigenous white farmers, those who are actually Zimbabweans, actually lost some farms. This story I don't think is new. Around 2024, we saw some moves actually the government setting aside money. I think it was around the figures differ. Some are saying 146 million, some are saying 125 million United States dollars to actually compensate some of those funds that were actually taken. Now I think the government is now intensifying. It's either the government is intensifying or the recent judgment by the High Court to actually release, remember the urban land investigation by Justice Uchena actually triggered some of these debates that actually happened in Parliament. The Minister Masuka was actually clear saying these funds are the government is not reversing the land reform. They're actually giving back, or rather correcting the mistake that actually took place in the 2000 land reform. So I don't think really that actually the land reform will be reversed in Zimbabwe. I think that has been done and it's in the past, and the non-indigenous farmers will be actually ready to give back those farms because they're now invested. Remember, a majority of land in Zimbabwe is now being farmed by indigenous people, and they are now actually starting to show results. Remember, with the mechanization program of irrigation, now Zimbabwe is able to export wheat. You know that some of the countries were actually requesting wheat from Zimbabwe. So I don't think it's a reversal of the land reform. I think it's just justice that the government is trying to do. Also looking at the sanctions issue. Remember, of late, or for the past 20 years, or should I say 26 years, you have seen Zimbabwe was under sanctions, and of late we saw the United States either removing or relaxing some of those sanctions, and I think it's fair for Zimbabwe to actually start being seen to be correcting some of the mistakes that they were unwilling to correct because of the illegal sanctions that were given to Zimbabwe.
Now, Delicious, the move here has been described by the government of Zimbabwe as addressing farms that were protected under bypass. For the benefit of our viewers, may you explain a bit further on what this means when they say these are farms that were protected under bypass, that the government here is willing to give back to the former commercial white farmers and also pay for. May shed some more light for the benefit of our viewers.
Remember, before the land reform, actually, Zimbabwe was one of the bread baskets. Actually, it was the bread basket of Southern Africa. And some of the produce that was being produced locally was being exported to European countries. And I think European countries actually took interest in terms of investing in the farms in Zimbabwe so that they can get local produce that is produced in Zimbabwe being exported to their countries. And we saw governments like Germany, Switzerland, and Netherlands actually getting into agreement with the government of Zimbabwe, whereby some of these farms were actually protected and highly productive. So that agreement, those agreements, they were meant to actually, I can say, to give confidence to those farmers who are on the ground. This was a government-to-government agreement that was meant to be honored by Zimbabwe in case, I think it was made in case of such upheavals as the land reform that we saw, so that those farms, they are not disturbed and the production is not disturbed in order to maintain a steady supply of farm produce to some of those countries that actually took interest in the Zimbabwe farming landscape.
Of course, the land issue in Zimbabwe has been a very topical one for many years, at least after independence. Now, for those of us who are just joining us and who may not know, the land issue in Zimbabwe has a colonial legacy. It was one of those reasons why the people of Zimbabwe went to war to fight the Rhodesian government. And the land imbalances are a result of colonialism, where the Rhodesian government enacted Land Husbandry Act laws that favored a few people at the expense of the majority. And of course, the farms that are being given back to the former colonial white farmers were protected under bilateral agreements. And also, those are some of the farms that had been bought by the concerned farmers. I'm sure this is a step in the right direction for Zimbabwe, for the Zimbabwean government, as this would allow the government to normalize relations with other countries. Of course, you may want to know that Zimbabwe was under sanctions from the UK and the US after the chaotic land reform program of 2000. For today, that's all we have for you on this program, the Kwedu Report. Till we meet again in the next edition, have a good night.